Emily Taylor, a 15-year-old girl, lived in the small town of Willow Creek, California. As a 10th grader, she wasn't the type to stand out, often feeling invisible among the social groups at her high school. Her days passed quietly in the classroom, with exhausting basketball practices and long nights studying in her bedroom. She was smart, always at the top of her class. But Emily wasn't the type to easily express her emotions or seek attention. Though she wasn't the center of attention, in her family, Emily was the pride of her parents. Her father, Michael Taylor, was a well-known civil rights lawyer in the area. He spent much of his time fighting for justice in cases related to educational rights and the rights of people who had been overlooked. Emily had heard countless stories about her father's legal battles since she was a child. Every time he came home after a long day, he would share stories about the cases he worked on. Stories about fighting against governmental and legal systems. Though she never imagined that she would step into her father's world, Emily was always fascinated by these stories, dreaming of a day when she could make a difference too. One evening, as her father came home looking exhausted and troubled, Emily saw him drop his briefcase by the door, rub his temples, and slump into a chair. "Long day, Dad?" Emily asked, setting a plate of hot lasagna on the table. "You could say that," Michael Taylor replied wearily. "I'm working on a case that could set a precedent, but—" He paused, his voice trailing off as he seemed to weigh his words. "They want to throw it out before we even get a hearing, and it's unfair." Emily sat down across from him, her concern evident. "What's the case about?" "It's about equal access to education," Michael said seriously. "A young girl in Riverside County was denied admission to her school because of a technicality. Her parents can't afford a lawyer, so I took the case pro bono. But the school board's lawyers are doing everything they can to bury it." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She couldn't imagine a child being shut out of school just because of a bureaucratic loophole. She thought about the other kids who didn't have the opportunity to go to school simply because they couldn't afford it. "That's terrible. Can't someone do something?" Michael sighed. "I'm trying. But these things take time and resources, and we don't have either. It's hard to fight a system like this." Over the next few weeks, Emily watched as her father became more worn down, the passion in his work dimming under the weight of the case. She wanted to help, but felt helpless. What could a 15-year-old do against a system that seemed so unfair? Then, one afternoon, while flipping through an old law book in her father's office, Emily came across something that would change everything. It was an old Supreme Court case, one that had redefined educational rights decades ago. As she read through it, an idea began to form in her mind, one that was bold and outrageous, but something that could actually make a difference. That evening, as her father came home, Emily blurted it out before she could lose her nerve. "Dad, what if I argued the case?" Her father froze mid-step, his tie half undone. "What? You want to argue in court?" "Yeah," Emily said quickly, not giving him a chance to stop her. "You always say that the law belongs to everyone, right? That it's about standing up for what's right, no matter who you are. So why can't I stand up for this girl?" Her father stared at her, his face unreadable, before finally shaking his head. "Emily, this isn't like school debates. Courtrooms will tear you apart." "What if they don't?" she countered. "What if I'm prepared?" He sighed deeply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious," Emily said, her voice steady. "I want to do this." And from that moment on, everything started to change. Over the next few days, Emily threw herself into studying. She read law books late into the night, her desk piled high with legal texts, case notes, and her father's worn-out files. Her mind raced with new concepts, the complex language of law, and the strategy needed to present a solid argument in court. Every time she felt herself losing confidence, she would push through, determined to make her case. Emily wasn't just fighting for the girl at the center of the case anymore. She was fighting for the principle of justice itself. Her father was skeptical but supportive. He helped her with her research and, at dinner, would often present hypothetical situations, challenging her to think critically about every angle of the case. Emily, though still shy and soft-spoken, began to find her voice. She spent hours in front of the mirror, practicing her delivery, rehearsing her arguments over and over again. Her friends thought she was crazy, and some even teased her about it. But she didn't care. Emily felt a fire growing inside her, a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. As the date of the hearing approached, the weight of the situation started to settle in. The pressure was immense. Emily had no formal legal training. She wasn't even old enough to vote. And she was going up against seasoned professionals in a courtroom. But the more she thought about it, the more determined she became. This wasn't about her. This was about fairness, equality, and the future of kids who were being left behind by the system. Emily felt like if she didn't stand up, who would? Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her suit, her palms clammy with nerves. She couldn't help but feel small in the face of the towering judge, the slick lawyers for the school board, and the audience that was already buzzing with anticipation. Her father stood beside her, offering her a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Emily," he said softly. "Just remember, this is about doing what's right. You've prepared. You know the facts. Now go out there and make them listen." The courthouse was filled with people when they arrived, reporters, legal teams, and curious onlookers. Emily felt her heart pounding as she entered the courtroom, but she tried to remain calm. She walked toward the podium, taking a deep breath. The room seemed to quiet the moment she stood in front of it. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Judge Harold Carver, an imposing figure with a stern face, adjusted his glasses and looked at Emily with a skeptical expression. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice thick with condescension, "you're a high school sophomore, and you're here to argue constitutional law in my courtroom?" He leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smirk. "Am I supposed to be impressed?" Laughter rippled through the audience, some of it mocking, others just bewildered at the idea of a teenage girl challenging the legal system. Emily gripped the podium tightly, her knuckles turning white. But her voice did not waver. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her words steady. "I believe this case is about more than one person's rights. It's about the rights of millions of students who are being denied access to education simply because of a technicality." Judge Carver raised an eyebrow, the smirk on his face widening. "Millions, you say? Fascinating." He looked at her, clearly amused. "I suppose you'll teach me the law now, Miss Taylor?" Emily's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I just might." The courtroom erupted into another round of laughter, but this time Emily didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down now. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Stand up for what's right." Judge Carver paused for a moment, looking at her with what almost seemed like genuine curiosity. He leaned forward slightly, his smirk fading just a bit. "Well, Miss Taylor, impress me," he said, motioning for her to proceed. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on Emily. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. This was it. This was her moment. "I stand before you today," she began, her voice carrying across the room, "to argue that this case is not just about one student's right to an education. This is about a system that has failed countless others. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience. It's about whether we as a society will continue to allow bureaucratic barriers to shut children out of education simply because they can't afford to fight back. She felt a surge of confidence as she spoke. The words were flowing now, the arguments she had practiced in her mind for so long coming together in the most powerful way possible. If we allow this to happen, what kind of message are we sending to the next generation? That their futures don't matter because of some technicality? That their worth is determined by their parents' ability to pay for legal representation? Emily's heart raced with each sentence. She could see Judge Carver leaning forward now, his expression less amused and more attentive. Even the school board's lawyers, who had been so smug just moments ago, seemed unsettled. Emily could feel the shift in the room, and for the first time she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. And then, as she was building momentum, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a dark suit walked in quickly, his face pale. He whispered something to the clerk, who nodded gravely and approached the judge. "Your Honor," the clerk said, her voice shaking, "there's been a development." Judge Carver's expression darkened as he glanced at Emily, then back at the clerk. "What kind of development?" The clerk hesitated before speaking again. "It's about her case, Your Honor. It might be bigger than we thought." The room erupted into chaos. Whispers filled the air, speculation running wild. Emily's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. What could be so important that it would interrupt her argument in the middle of the session? Judge Carver slammed his gavel 3 times, demanding order. "Silence!" he barked, and the room quieted, though tension still hung thick in the air. He turned to the clerk, his tone sharp. "What's going on?" The clerk spoke again, her voice trembling. "Your Honor, I've been informed that there's an ongoing federal investigation linked to the subject of Miss Taylor's case." Emily's stomach tightened. A federal investigation? Her case was linked to something that big? The clerk continued. "The Department of Justice is reviewing allegations of widespread misconduct in public school admissions across the state, and it seems that Miss Taylor's case may be pivotal to their inquiry." Gasps rippled through the audience. Emily's mind raced, trying to process the news. How could this small case be part of something so massive? Judge Carver's face darkened as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism, "did you know anything about this?" Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of it." "Well," Judge Carver said, gesturing to the clerk, "I suppose we'll need to sort this out before proceeding. This court will adjourn temporarily, while I review the implications of this unexpected development." With a decisive crack of the gavel, the room was filled with murmurs once again. Emily turned to her father, who was seated in the front row. His face was pale and unreadable. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, Em," he admitted, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But whatever it is, you've just stepped into something much bigger than we realized." The recess felt like an eternity to Emily. She sat in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process everything that had just happened. The courtroom was abuzz with whispers, but she couldn't bring herself to focus on anything other than the words that had just been spoken. A federal investigation? How was her small case now tied to something so monumental? Her father sat beside her, his face drawn tight with concern. "I'm not sure what this all means yet, but whatever it is, it's big," he said quietly. "You've done something no one expected. This case is no longer just about one student. It's part of something much larger now, and that's going to change everything." Emily nodded, trying to wrap her mind around the gravity of the situation. She had never anticipated this kind of turn in her fight for justice. When she first stood in front of Judge Carver, it was just about helping one girl, about standing up for what was right. Now, with the Department of Justice involved, everything was different. The eyes of the nation were on her, and the weight of that realization almost made her want to crumble. But Emily was not one to back down. Not now, not when she had come so far. The courtroom slowly began to settle as the judge's gavel came down again, signaling the end of the recess. Judge Carver returned to the bench, his expression stern. "I have reviewed the implications of the federal investigation," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "And while we will continue with this case, I must caution all parties that we are now operating under a microscope. This is no longer just a local issue." Emily's heart raced as she listened. She could feel the pressure mounting again, but this time it wasn't just about convincing a judge. It was about proving her argument in front of a much bigger audience. The entire system was now watching her, and if she failed, the consequences could be devastating. Judge Carver cleared his throat. "Miss Taylor," he said, turning his gaze toward her, "you may continue with your argument, but I suggest you tread carefully. The legal waters have just gotten much deeper." Emily took a deep breath, her hands still gripping the podium. She had already made her case, but now the stakes were higher than ever. She wasn't just arguing for one girl's right to education anymore. She was arguing for a system that had systematically failed countless others. This wasn't just about technicalities. It was about corruption, about power, about breaking down the walls that kept the disadvantaged from getting a fair shot. She began speaking, her voice steady as she laid out the next part of her argument. She cited specific cases where students had been wrongfully denied access to schools because of bureaucratic loopholes, and how this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern. She reminded the judge that this wasn't just about one individual's rights. This was about the millions of students who had been denied their opportunity for a better future. For the first time, Emily noticed the shift in the room. The atmosphere, which had been tense and skeptical, now seemed to be shifting in her favor. She wasn't just making a case for fairness anymore. She was making a case for justice, and the room could feel it. But then, just as she was starting to gain momentum, the doors of the courtroom burst open once again. A man in a dark suit strode in quickly, his face pale and his expression tense. He whispered something to the clerk, who nodded and walked over to Judge Carver with urgency in her step. "Your Honor," the clerk said, her voice shaky, "there has been an urgent development." Emily's pulse quickened as the courtroom erupted into a murmur of confusion. She turned to her father, her heart racing as she tried to figure out what was going on. "What now?" Judge Carver, clearly irritated by the interruption, slammed his gavel again. "Silence!" he ordered. The room quieted, though the tension was thick in the air. The clerk approached the judge with a sealed envelope. "Your Honor, this is a communication from the Department of Justice," she said. "It's related to the federal investigation, and it could change the course of this case." Emily's stomach dropped. A new development? What could it be? Judge Carver opened the envelope slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. As he read, his face grew darker, his brow furrowing in concern. Emily sat frozen, trying to decipher his expression. This wasn't just an ordinary update. This was something important, something that could shift the entire direction of the case. After a long pause, Judge Carver looked up, his voice low but commanding. "This court has just received new evidence from the Department of Justice. The investigation into systemic misconduct in public school admissions across the state has uncovered disturbing new information. Gasps rippled through the audience as Emily's heart pounded in her chest. What new evidence? What was happening now? This is no longer just a local matter, Judge Carver continued, his voice heavy. The case Miss Taylor has brought forward is now a focal point in a national inquiry into corruption and manipulation within our public education system. Emily's head spun. How could this little case, one that she had thought was just about helping one student, now be part of a nationwide scandal? The room was filled with whispers as people tried to process the news. Some reporters frantically scribbled down notes, while others turned to one another in hushed conversations. Emily could feel their eyes on her. She was the center of it all now. The weight of the situation felt unbearable, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had a job to do. Her father, sitting in the front row, caught her eye and gave her a small nod of encouragement. He knew as well as she did that this case had gone beyond what they had ever imagined. But that didn't mean they were going to give up. Judge Carver leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled together in thought. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice less hostile but no less commanding, "you've opened the door to a much larger investigation. This is no longer just about one girl's education. This is about something far greater. Are you prepared to handle the implications of that?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. This was it. Everything had led to this moment, but she wasn't about to back down now. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm prepared." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to the opposing counsel. "I suggest you all be prepared as well. The stakes have just been raised." The gavel came down with a final crack. Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the next steps. As Emily left the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the day's events pressing on her shoulders. The battle was far from over, and now it seemed like it had become something much bigger than she had ever imagined. But one thing was certain. She wasn't backing down. The fight for justice had just begun, and Emily was ready to see it through to the end. The next day, Emily arrived at the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. Her mind, though still spinning from the previous day's developments, was focused. The stakes were now higher than ever, and she knew that this case was no longer just a fight for one girl's right to an education. It had become a battle that could potentially expose the deeply ingrained corruption within the education system, a system that had for so long pushed marginalized students to the edges, denying them access to the opportunities that should have been their right. As she stepped into the courthouse, Emily was met with a frenzy of media attention. Cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to get a glimpse of her, their questions coming at her like rapid fire. "Miss Taylor, do you think the Department of Justice will continue its investigation into this case? How do you feel about the potential for your case to set a national precedent? What's next for you in this fight?" The questions felt suffocating, and for a moment, Emily thought she might falter. But then she remembered why she was here. She had already stepped into a fight much bigger than herself. She had already decided that no matter how many questions they threw at her, no matter how many threats they made, she would keep going. For the students who had been overlooked. For the ones who had been denied their future because of a broken system. She didn't have time to dwell on the reporters or the cameras. Emily was here to do one thing: make her case. Her father walked beside her, offering silent encouragement, as always. But she could feel his concern. He had seen the kind of pressure they were under. He knew the forces they were up against were powerful. The courtroom felt heavier than ever. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone present was bracing for a storm. Emily took her place at the podium, adjusting her papers, trying to steady her breath. Judge Carver took his seat, his expression unreadable, but Emily could feel the weight of his gaze. It was clear that today, the case would take another significant turn. "Miss Taylor," Judge Carver said, his voice calm but firm, "yesterday, we discussed the implications of the federal investigation linked to your case. Now that the court has reviewed the new evidence provided by the Department of Justice, we will proceed with hearing your argument. But I remind you, once again, that the stakes are much higher than they were when you first began." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. She was no longer just fighting for fairness. Now, it was about exposing something much bigger, something more dangerous. She began her argument, speaking slowly and clearly, laying out the new evidence that had surfaced in the investigation. "This case is no longer just about one individual," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It is about a systemic issue that has been buried for far too long. What we are seeing here is not just one isolated incident. It is part of a coordinated effort to systematically deny access to education to students who don't fit the mold of what these schools want. We've seen evidence of this across multiple districts." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. The room was silent, everyone listening closely. She could feel the pressure of their attention, but she wasn't going to let it intimidate her. "The truth is," Emily continued, "the system is rigged against the disadvantaged. We're talking about a pattern of exclusion that affects entire communities. And if we don't do something now, we will continue to perpetuate a cycle of inequality that harms generations to come." Her argument was bold, but it was also well-reasoned. She had spent hours poring over case law, researching precedents, and refining her presentation. The evidence she had gathered from the Department of Justice was undeniable. This wasn't just about one girl who had been wronged. It was about the entire system failing the students who needed it most. As she spoke, Emily could feel the judge's gaze shifting. He wasn't as dismissive as before. His posture was more attentive, his expression less skeptical. It was a small shift, but it gave her hope. For the first time in the trial, it felt like her words were actually having an impact. But just as Emily thought she was gaining traction, there was another interruption. The doors of the courtroom swung open, and a figure in a sharp suit entered, his face pale and tense. It was Richard Daniels, the representative from the California Association of Public School Administrators, the very group that had been pushing back against Emily's case from the beginning. Daniels strode toward the judge, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharp, "this case is a threat to the integrity of the entire system. The plaintiff's legal counsel is unqualified to argue this case. I move that it be dismissed immediately." Emily's heart sank. She had anticipated resistance from the school board's lawyers, but this was different. Daniels wasn't just trying to discredit her argument, he was trying to discredit her. Period. Judge Carver looked at Daniels with a raised eyebrow. "Mr. Daniels," he said, his voice firm but calm, "I understand your concerns, but I will not tolerate interruptions. Miss Taylor has the right to present her case. We will proceed." Daniels stood there for a moment, clearly displeased, but he reluctantly retreated to the back of the room. Emily could feel his eyes on her as she returned to the podium. She swallowed the lump in her throat and pushed forward, not letting the interruption shake her resolve. The rest of the hearing proceeded with more tension than ever. The school board's lawyers were doing everything they could to undermine Emily's credibility. They tried to question her knowledge of the law, to make her seem inexperienced and out of her depth. But Emily wasn't intimidated. She had prepared for every challenge they threw her way. Each time they tried to twist her words or trip her up with legal jargon, she calmly countered their arguments with facts and logic. "Your Honor," one of the school board's lawyers, Nancy Whitaker, said after Emily finished a particularly strong point, "While Miss Taylor's arguments are admirable, they fail to address the larger context. This case is about individual responsibility. The family of the plaintiff chose not to comply with district regulations. This isn't about systemic discrimination. This is about a family's failure to follow the rules." Emily's blood ran cold as she realized where Whitaker was going with this. She had known the defense would try to play the individual responsibility card, but she was ready for it. She stood taller, her voice steady as she replied. "Respectfully, Miss Whitaker," Emily began, "this isn't about one family's actions. This is about whether those regulations are being applied fairly and equally. It's about whether we are using the law to exclude people who don't have the resources to fight back, or whether we are using it to protect those who need it most." The room fell silent. Emily's words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like everyone was waiting for the next move. She could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze on her, but this time, instead of feeling nervous, she felt empowered. She was doing the right thing. She wasn't just making a case, she was making a stand. But just as the room seemed to shift in her favor, the courtroom doors burst open once more. This time, an officer entered, carrying a stack of papers. "Your Honor," the officer said, "these are subpoenas from the Department of Justice. They request all records related to this case, as well as similar cases from across the state." Emily's mind raced. The Department of Justice had just escalated their involvement even further. What did this mean for her case? Judge Carver flipped through the stack of papers, his face hardening with each page. "This is highly unusual," he muttered, clearly unsettled by the developments. He turned to the clerk, who was standing by the bench. "I will review these subpoenas, but I need to make sure that everything is in order before we proceed." The courtroom erupted into chatter, and Emily sat frozen at the podium. She had stepped into a battle that was bigger than she could have ever imagined. The fight for justice had become a national movement, and it was clear that nothing would be the same again. The next few weeks felt like an endless cycle of preparations, hearings, and growing tension. The case had exploded into a national sensation, and Emily was now the face of a movement for educational equality. News outlets continued to follow the case closely, and Emily found herself constantly surrounded by cameras and reporters. But the attention was not all positive. The forces against her had grown more organized, more strategic, and more aggressive. The deeper the investigation went, the more powerful the opposition seemed. At home, Emily could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. Every moment felt like a step toward something bigger, but it was also fraught with peril. Her father, though proud of her, had grown more concerned. The threats had escalated. Strange phone calls, anonymous messages, and even a threatening letter left at their doorstep one night. Every time Emily tried to push the fear aside, the harsh reality of the fight she was in crept back in. Despite everything, she couldn't back down. The more she heard about the corruption in the education system, the more determined she became. Her father's nightly advice echoed in her mind. The hardest fights are the ones worth fighting. And this fight, against a system that had systematically discriminated against the disadvantaged, was one she knew she had to see through to the end. Emily's daily routine became a blur of strategy sessions with her father, meetings with her legal team, and continued study. The case had grown far more complex than she had ever anticipated. New evidence continued to surface, and every time it did, The opposition fought harder to discredit it. But Emily held strong. She knew that each new piece of evidence made her case stronger. The systemic flaws in the education system were there for everyone to see, and she was determined to be the one to expose them. One day, as Emily was sitting in her father's office going over the latest round of evidence, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Stephanie Grant, the lead attorney from the Department of Justice, who had been working closely with Emily's team. "Emily, we need to talk. It's urgent." She stood up immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. It had become a routine by now. The sudden messages, the unexpected calls, the urgent whispers. Every time she received one, she felt the pressure mount even higher. It was like a clock ticking down to something inevitable, something that she wasn't sure she was ready for. Her father, noticing her urgency, raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "Stephanie wants to meet. She says it's urgent." Her father nodded, his expression darkening. "Be careful, Em. Whatever this is, it's likely another development we're not prepared for. But you know the drill. Stick to the facts. Don't let them throw you off." Stephanie's office was not far from the courthouse, and within minutes, Emily and her father were there. They were ushered into a conference room where Stephanie was waiting, her face grave. "We've uncovered something major," Stephanie began, without any pleasantries, her voice low and intense. "Something that changes everything." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She exchanged a glance with her father, who looked just as wary as she felt. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephanie tapped a few keys on her laptop, and a series of emails appeared on the screen. They were highlighted in yellow, and Emily could see that they were all from various members of the school board and associated lobbying groups. "These emails were leaked to us," Stephanie continued, her voice tense. "They show a coordinated effort by the school boards and several powerful lobbying groups to exclude students from underprivileged backgrounds from certain public schools." Emily leaned forward, her eyes scanning the emails. The contents made her blood run cold. The documents were damning. They weren't just talking about one or two cases. They were talking about an entire framework designed to shut out low-income students. The emails included instructions on how to manipulate enrollment data, how to pressure schools into rejecting students who didn't fit the ideal profile, and even how to silence those who might try to speak out. "This is systematic," Emily said quietly, her voice shaking. "This is worse than I thought." Her father's face was pale as he scanned the emails. "How high up does this go?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Very high," Stephanie replied, her tone cold and hard. "These emails implicate several high-ranking individuals, some with connections to both state and federal government. This is a coordinated effort to protect a corrupt system, and they'll do anything to keep it in place." Emily's stomach twisted. She had known that the system was flawed, but she hadn't imagined the depth of the corruption she was up against. They weren't just fighting for fairness. They were fighting to expose a machine that had been built to oppress the most vulnerable. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We push forward," Stephanie said firmly, her eyes locking with Emily's. "We take this to court. We expose this. But I need you to be ready, Emily. This isn't just a fight against the school boards anymore. This is a political battle, and they will fight dirty." The weight of Stephanie's words hung in the air. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had known that this was never going to be easy, but now the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just fighting for one girl's right to an education anymore. She was fighting for the future of countless students, for a system that had long failed those who needed it most. As they left Stephanie's office, her father put a hand on her shoulder. "You're doing great, Em. he said, his voice filled with pride. "But you need to be ready for what's coming. They'll come after you harder than ever now." Emily nodded, though her heart was heavy with uncertainty. She wasn't sure how much more she could handle, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop now. The next morning, as Emily entered the courtroom, she felt the familiar buzz of anticipation in the air. The reporters were there, their cameras trained on her as she walked toward the podium. The opposition's lawyers were ready, their faces set in expressions of determination. Judge Carver called the court to order, his gavel striking down firmly. Emily could feel the weight of the moment, but she held her ground. This was it. The fight for justice had reached its peak, and Emily was ready to face whatever came next. As she began speaking, her voice steady and strong, she laid out the new evidence, the leaked emails, the damning documents. The room was silent as she presented the case, her words echoing in the stillness. She wasn't just arguing for fairness anymore. She was arguing for the truth. And as the audience listened, Emily could feel the tide beginning to shift. For the first time in this long battle, it felt like the truth was on her side. But just as she thought she was gaining ground, Nancy Whitaker, the lead lawyer for the school board, stood up, her expression cold and calculating. "Your Honor," she said, "this evidence is irrelevant to the specific case at hand. It is an attempt to broaden the scope of the case in an effort to distract from the real issues." Emily's heart raced as she prepared to respond, knowing that this was the moment that could make or break her case. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Nancy Whitaker's challenge rang out. She was an experienced lawyer with a reputation for being sharp, relentless, and calculating. Emily knew that the next few moments would determine whether she could keep the momentum she had gained or if the tide would turn against her. Her pulse quickened, but she stayed composed, focusing on the facts and the evidence she had meticulously gathered. This was not the time to let emotions control her. This was a fight for truth, and Emily was ready to stand tall. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice calm but unwavering, "this case isn't about the narrow scope of one individual's denial. It's about systemic injustice that affects countless students. The evidence we presented, these emails, prove that this issue is not isolated. It's widespread, systematic, and embedded in the very fabric of how certain school districts operate. If we ignore this larger issue, we're simply brushing the problem under the rug, and that is unacceptable." She could feel the weight of her words, and she saw some of the audience members shift in their seats, some nodding along as her argument began to sink in. Emily's father, seated in the front row, gave her an encouraging glance. She was doing it. She was standing her ground, fighting not just for one case, but for an entire system that had long been broken. Nancy Whitaker's expression remained unchanged. "Your Honor," she said, her tone icy, "we respectfully disagree with the plaintiff's argument. These emails may suggest isolated incidents, but they do not provide proof of systemic discrimination. It is a clear attempt to widen the scope of this case and deflect attention from the real issue, the plaintiff's failure to comply with district regulations." Emily knew she had to respond carefully. Whitaker was attempting to discredit the evidence, to reduce it to something irrelevant. She couldn't let that happen. The eyes of the world were watching, and she was not about to let this moment slip away. "Respectfully, Miss Whitaker," Emily said, her voice sharp now, "these documents show more than just isolated incidents. They lay bare a coordinated effort to exclude students who don't fit a certain mold. These are not just technicalities. This is a deliberate, sustained effort to keep certain groups of students out of schools based on their background, their financial status, or their perceived lack of value to the education system." We cannot continue to allow these practices to go unnoticed, and we certainly cannot allow them to go unpunished. The room seemed to hold its breath as Emily's words landed. Even Judge Carver, who had previously been distant and somewhat skeptical, seemed to be paying closer attention. He leaned forward in his seat, his fingers steepled, as if considering her words carefully. "You make a strong point, Miss Taylor," Judge Carver said, his voice thoughtful. "But you must remember, this court's responsibility is to focus on the case at hand. I will not allow this to become a political spectacle. We are here to address the legal question regarding the denial of admission. The rest, well, that may be for another time." Emily nodded, acknowledging the judge's point. She understood that the court was limited in what it could address, but she also knew that it was her duty to expose the truth, even if it meant pushing the boundaries. The system needed to be held accountable. "Your Honor," Emily continued, "I understand that we must remain focused on the specific issue of the plaintiff's admission. But I argue that we cannot divorce this issue from the broader context. The denial of this student's education is not just a matter of one student failing to meet requirements. It is about a system that has been deliberately designed to keep certain students out. A system that, by its very structure, favors the wealthy and the connected over the poor and disenfranchised. If we allow this court to ignore the systemic issues at play, we are complicit in perpetuating the very injustice we claim to oppose." Her voice was growing stronger now, the weight of her words fueling her confidence. She could feel the energy in the room shift. She wasn't just making a legal argument anymore. She was telling the story of thousands of students who had been pushed aside by a broken system. She wasn't going to let the judge or anyone else forget that. Nancy Whitaker looked like she was about to interrupt again, but Judge Carver raised his hand, signaling her to be quiet. "I've heard enough," he said. "This case has become more complex than I anticipated. I will take all of this into account as we proceed. But for now, I will allow Miss Taylor to continue presenting her argument." The air in the courtroom felt charged with anticipation. The stakes had just been raised once more. Emily knew that the fight was far from over, but she also knew that she had just made her case stronger than ever. The judge was listening. The audience was listening. She was being heard. As Emily prepared to continue, a new voice interrupted the proceedings. The courtroom doors burst open, and a man in a dark suit walked in briskly. He was tall, with a sharp, stern expression, and Emily recognized him immediately. It was Richard Daniels, the high-ranking representative of the California Association of Public School Administrators, the man who had been the staunchest opponent of her case from the very beginning. Daniels approached the judge with a sense of urgency, his face pale and tight with tension. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the air, "this case is about to destroy the integrity of our entire public school system. The plaintiff's case is being manipulated to push an agenda that goes far beyond what is legal or reasonable. If this case is allowed to proceed, it will have catastrophic consequences for every public school district in the state. I demand that it be dismissed immediately." The room erupted into a chorus of murmurs, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Daniels was not just attacking the case anymore. He was attacking her directly. He was attempting to discredit everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. "Order!" Judge Carver barked, his gavel striking down firmly. "Mr. Daniels, I've heard your concerns, but unless you have concrete evidence to support your claims, I will not tolerate further disruptions. This case will proceed as planned." Daniels hesitated for a moment, clearly frustrated, but he finally turned and retreated to the back of the courtroom. Emily watched him closely, her heart racing. He was a powerful man, with ties to the highest levels of education policy. But she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. This was her fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. The rest of the hearing proceeded with a renewed sense of urgency. The school board's lawyers continued to push back against Emily's arguments, but she stood firm, countering each of their moves with clarity and confidence. She wasn't just relying on facts anymore. She was speaking from the heart, telling the truth as she saw it, no matter how hard it was for others to hear. As the session drew to a close, Judge Carver called for a brief recess. Emily sat down at the plaintiff's table, her hands trembling from the intensity of the proceedings. Her father gave her a proud smile, but she could see the concern still etched on his face. "You did well, Em," he said quietly, "but this is only the beginning." Emily nodded. She knew that. She had come this far, but there was still a long road ahead. There would be more attacks, more obstacles, and more challenges. But she wasn't backing down. The fight for justice had only just begun. As the days passed and the hearings continued, Emily felt the weight of the case bearing down on her in ways she hadn't imagined. What had once been a personal battle for fairness had transformed into a nationwide spectacle. The press was relentless, and the court was under constant scrutiny. Each day, more and more people began to understand the depth of the systemic issues she was exposing, and with that understanding came a rising tide of pressure. Emily was no stranger to pressure. In fact, she thrived in it. But this was different. This was a battle on a scale she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about getting one student into a school. It was about confronting an entire system of inequality that had persisted for generations. And the more she learned, the more determined she became to see it through. Her father continued to offer her words of encouragement, but Emily could see the toll it was taking on him as well. He had always been her rock, the person who taught her that fighting for what's right was always worth it. But even he knew that the forces against them were powerful, and the political ramifications of this case were far-reaching. They weren't just fighting a legal battle, they were fighting an entrenched system that would stop at nothing to protect itself. One evening, after another long day in court, Emily sat in her bedroom, surrounded by piles of legal books, case files, and notes. Her mind was spinning as she tried to keep track of all the developments. New evidence, additional testimonies, and continued pressure from the opposition made it feel like they were constantly on the defensive. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when so many people were depending on her to expose the truth. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Stephanie Grant. "Emily, we need to talk. It's important. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. The urgency in Stephanie's tone was unmistakable. What now? She glanced at her father, who had been silently reading the news reports about the case. He looked up when he saw the concern in her eyes. "What's going on, Em?" he asked, sensing her unease. "Stephanie wants to meet tomorrow," Emily replied. "She says it's important." Her father put down his papers and stood up. "Well, whatever it is, you're not in this alone. We'll face it together." The next morning, Emily met Stephanie at the Department of Justice office. She could tell from Stephanie's expression that whatever they were about to discuss was serious. "Emily," Stephanie began, her voice low and steady, "we've uncovered something that could change everything." Emily felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. "What's happened?" Stephanie motioned for Emily to sit, and then placed a thick folder on the table. This is a collection of leaked documents from a lobbyist working with several high-ranking officials in the education sector. These documents show a coordinated effort between school boards, state officials, and even some federal representatives to block any attempts to address systemic inequality in the public education system. Emily stared at the folder, her mind racing. She had suspected that there was more to the case than just local corruption. But this was on an entirely different level. These documents show that the people in power knew what was happening, Stephanie continued. They knew that students from marginalized communities were being excluded from schools, and they deliberately made it more difficult for them to access education. They've been using political influence and legal loopholes to maintain the status quo. Emily's mind spun as she processed the gravity of what she was hearing. How deep does this go? Are there people in the government involved? Stephanie's face was grim. Yes. The emails and reports in this folder show that this isn't just happening in 1 or 2 districts. This is a statewide issue, and we believe it extends to the federal level as well. There's a network of people involved in this, and they've been working together for years to prevent any real change. Emily felt her breath catch in her chest. This was far worse than she had ever imagined. She had been fighting for fairness, but now she realized that she wasn't just up against a few bad actors. She was up against a well-organized machine, one that had been working for years to keep power and resources concentrated in the hands of a few, while denying access to the people who needed it most. "I never imagined it would be this big," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was just fighting for one student, but now it's about something so much bigger." Stephanie nodded solemnly. "This is the moment where things get even more dangerous, Emily. The people involved in this will stop at nothing to protect themselves. They'll try to discredit you. They'll try to intimidate you. And they'll pull every political string they can to bury this case." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She had known the fight would be difficult, but now it felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, and the entire case could collapse. But she couldn't back down. She had already come this far, and the truth was out there. She couldn't let these people continue to hide it. "I'm not backing down," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "We've come too far to stop now. The truth has to come out." Stephanie looked at her with a mix of respect and concern. "You're stronger than most people I know, Emily. But you need to be prepared. The opposition will get fiercer. They'll attack your credibility, your character, everything. This case has become about far more than just legal arguments. It's a fight for the future." Emily nodded, her mind made up. She wasn't just fighting for one girl anymore. She was fighting for the millions of students who had been denied an equal shot at an education. She was fighting for every child whose future had been stolen by a system that didn't care about them. The next day, the courtroom was packed with reporters and legal teams. The tension was palpable as Emily stood in front of Judge Carver, ready to present the new evidence that had just been uncovered. The audience was buzzing with anticipation, and Emily could feel the weight of their eyes on her. Judge Carver cleared his throat, signaling for silence. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice as stern as ever, "you may proceed with presenting your evidence. But I remind you that the scope of this case is still limited. You will remain focused on the issue of the plaintiff's admission. Any attempts to broaden the scope will not be tolerated." Emily took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and now it was time to lay everything out. She opened the folder containing the leaked documents, and with steady hands, she began to present them to the court. "Your Honor," Emily began, "these documents show that the systematic exclusion of certain students from public schools was not an accident. It was deliberate. These documents prove that high-ranking officials, working with lobbying groups, used their power to block students from receiving the education they deserve." The courtroom fell silent as Emily presented the evidence. She could feel the weight of the room's attention on her, but she didn't falter. The documents were irrefutable, and she knew that this was the moment that could change everything. She laid out the connections between the school boards, the state officials, and the lobbyists. She showed how they had worked together to craft policies designed to exclude low-income and minority students from better schools. As Emily spoke, she could see the audience begin to shift. People who had once been skeptical of her case were now leaning forward, listening intently. Even the opposing lawyers seemed taken aback by the weight of the evidence she was presenting. It wasn't just a legal argument anymore. This was a story of corruption, of power used to maintain an unjust status quo. And Emily was determined to make sure that story was heard. The courtroom was electric. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. The crowd was silent, hanging on Emily's every word as she presented the damning evidence against the corruption in the public education system. The emails, the documents, the testimonies, all of it was coming together in a way that left no room for doubt. The system was broken, and Emily was the one who was about to expose it to the world. But even as the truth hung in the balance, Emily could feel the forces of resistance growing stronger. The backlash was coming, and it was coming fast. Judge Carver, who had been unusually quiet during Emily's presentation, finally spoke. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice low but commanding, "the evidence you have presented is indeed troubling. It paints a picture of systemic issues that extend far beyond this case. However, I must remind you that this court is bound by the parameters of the case at hand. We are not here to investigate the broader allegations you've outlined today. We are here to address the specific question of whether your client was wrongfully denied admission to the school." Emily felt the weight of his words, but she wasn't about to let the judge's narrow focus stop her. This wasn't just about one student. It was about an entire generation of students who had been left behind by the system. And she was determined to make sure their voices were heard, even if it meant pushing the boundaries of the court's focus. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the room, "I understand that the court is focused on the specific case at hand, but I must argue that to ignore the systemic issues that are present here is to ignore the truth. If we allow these practices to continue unchecked, we are sending the message that these students don't matter. And that message is not one I am willing to accept." The room held its breath as Emily's words hung in the air. She could see some of the people in the audience shifting in their seats, murmurs running through the crowd. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she stood firm. This was her moment. But before Emily could continue, the defense team jumped into action. Nancy Whitaker, the lead attorney for the school board, stood up with a look of cold determination. "Your Honor," she said, "we request that this evidence be dismissed. It is irrelevant to the case at hand, and constitutes an attempt to broaden the scope of the trial beyond what is legally permissible." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Emily could feel the ground beneath her shift. Whitaker's move was a direct attack on her credibility. She wasn't just fighting to win this case anymore. She was fighting for her very right to stand in that courtroom and argue. And if she lost that battle, everything she had worked for could come crashing down. Judge Carver paused, his gaze moving between Emily and Whitaker. "I will take your request under advisement," he said, his voice heavy with deliberation. "But let me make one thing clear. This court is not here to make political statements. We will not allow this case to become a spectacle." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The battle for the case had just taken a sharp turn. She was no longer just fighting for justice for one student. She was fighting to hold on to the integrity of the case itself. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going under this level of scrutiny. As the judge called for a recess, Emily turned to her father, who was sitting in the front row. His face was unreadable, his jaw tight. She could see the worry in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She knew what he was thinking. The opposition wasn't going to back down. The stakes had just gotten even higher. During the break, Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, her mind spinning. She knew they had evidence. She knew they had a case. But the more the opposition fought back, the more Emily wondered if she was ready for what was coming next. Her father had always told her that the hardest battles were the ones worth fighting. But this was the kind of fight that could destroy everything she had worked for. And then, as if on cue, the door to the courtroom opened, and another figure strode in. It was Richard Daniels again, the representative from the California Association of Public School Administrators. He walked up to the judge's bench with an air of quiet authority, but his face was grim. Emily watched him carefully, her stomach tightening. He whispered something to Judge Carver, who nodded and looked back at Emily. She could feel the tension building in the room as the judge turned his attention to the clerk, who had been handed a folder by Daniels. Emily's heart sank as she wondered what new obstacle was being thrown her way. After a moment of silence, Judge Carver spoke. "The court has received additional information related to this case," he said, his tone unreadable. "It appears there has been some influence from outside parties in the handling of this case, and we need to address that issue before we proceed." Emily's mind raced. This was bad. This wasn't just about the legal arguments anymore. This was about outside forces trying to control the outcome of the case. She could feel the walls closing in around her, but she wasn't ready to back down. She couldn't. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Daniels continued to speak, his voice sharp with authority. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that this case has been manipulated for political purposes," he said. "There are powerful interests at play here, and we believe that the plaintiff's legal team is involved in a coordinated effort to push an agenda that goes far beyond the rights of the student in question." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. This was the kind of attack she had feared, the kind that threatened not only the case, but her own personal integrity. She had worked so hard to get to this point, and now it felt like everything was on the verge of unraveling. Judge Carver's voice cut through the noise. "Enough," he commanded, slamming his gavel down. The room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Mr. Daniels, I will not allow this court to be used for political purposes. We are here to address the facts. If you have evidence to support your claims, I suggest you present it." Daniels hesitated for a moment, clearly frustrated, but eventually he stepped back. The courtroom was tense, everyone watching to see how the judge would proceed. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was the moment that could change everything. The opposition had come for her credibility, but she wasn't going to let them win. As the judge gave the signal to resume the proceedings, Emily stood up, her mind clearer than before. She knew that the road ahead was going to be filled with challenges. The political forces were pulling all the strings they could, but Emily was determined to keep fighting. This wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about the future of every student who had been denied access to education, and she wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the tension reached a boiling point. The forces against Emily were stronger than ever. Richard Daniels, the representative from the California Association of Public School Administrators, had done his best to discredit not only her case, but her very presence in that courtroom. But Emily wasn't about to let his attacks break her resolve. This was no longer just about a legal case. It was about something much bigger, exposing a broken system and standing up for what was right. Judge Carver, who had maintained a neutral stance throughout the proceedings, had been shaken by the recent developments. Daniels' claims that the case was politically motivated had sent a ripple of doubt through the room. Emily could see that even the judge, despite his usual stoicism, was grappling with the implications. She had fought hard to present her evidence, but now everything she had worked for was being called into question. Yet, in this moment of chaos, Emily stood firm. She was here because the system had failed her, failed the young girl at the heart of this case, and failed millions of other students like her. She couldn't afford to let this moment slip away. She had to keep fighting. "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with quiet resolve, "I understand the concerns raised by Mr. Daniels, but I respectfully disagree with his characterization of this case. This case is not about a political agenda. It is about ensuring that every student, regardless of their background or socioeconomic status, has the opportunity to receive an education. What we are seeing here today is not just a simple legal issue. It is about correcting systemic failures that have persisted for far too long." The room went silent as Emily's words rang out, her voice unwavering. Even the defense team seemed momentarily caught off guard by the strength of her conviction. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that it could go either way. The pressure was unbearable, but she wasn't going to let them take this from her. Not now, not after everything she had done to get this far. She continued, "The evidence we've presented today, the documents, the testimonies, all point to one undeniable truth. Students across the state have been systematically excluded from educational opportunities due to a broken system that favors the wealthy and the connected. If we allow this court to be swayed by political distractions or outside interference, we will only be perpetuating the same injustices we claim to fight against." Emily could feel a shift in the room as she spoke. The murmurs in the audience grew quieter, and even the opposing lawyers seemed to hesitate. She had said the words that needed to be said. Now, it was up to the judge to decide whether he would stand by the truth or allow this case to be swept under the rug. Judge Carver leaned forward in his seat, his fingers steepled together as he pondered Emily's words. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Taylor," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority, "I have reviewed all the evidence, and I have heard the arguments presented by both sides. I must admit, this case has grown far more complicated than I initially anticipated. However, I believe it is my duty to ensure that justice is served." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was he going to rule against her? Would all of her hard work be for nothing? Judge Carver continued, "While I understand the concerns about the broader implications of this case, I cannot ignore the compelling evidence presented. This court will not stand idly by while students are denied their right to an education based on a system that actively works against them." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily allowed herself to breathe. She had won. The battle was far from over, but this moment was a victory. She could see it in her father's eyes, the pride and relief mixed together. He knew how hard she had fought, and now she had been vindicated. Judge Carver raised his gavel. "This case will proceed to a full hearing," he declared. "The Department of Justice will continue its investigation, and we will work to address the systemic issues that have been uncovered. The plaintiff's right to argue the case has been affirmed. The larger issue of discrimination and corruption in the education system will be addressed." The room erupted into applause, a sound that seemed almost surreal to Emily. She had done it. She had not only exposed the broken system, but had also secured the opportunity to bring it to the attention of the world. But even as the applause filled the room, Emily knew that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. There were still powerful forces working against her, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. The truth had been revealed, and it couldn't be ignored. As the courtroom emptied, Emily walked out with her father and Stephanie. The weight of the victory hung in the air, but Emily knew that there was still much to be done. The media frenzy had already begun, and soon the entire nation would know what had been happening behind closed doors in the education system. Later that night, as Emily sat on the porch of their home, looking out at the stars, her father joined her. He sat down beside her, and for a long time, they didn't speak. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the understanding of everything they had just been through. "You did it, Em," her father finally said, his voice filled with pride. "I'm so proud of you." Emily smiled faintly, feeling the weight of his words. "We did it," she corrected him. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her father chuckled, ruffling her hair. "You've got your mother's strength. She would have been so proud of you, too." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she thought of her mother. She had lost her mom years ago, but in moments like this, she could feel her presence, like a quiet strength beside her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Her mom had always fought for what was right, and now Emily was continuing that legacy. "Thanks, Dad," Emily said softly, "for everything." They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Emily looked up at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter tonight, as if they were telling her that everything would be okay. The fight wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. She had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, she had opened a door for others to follow. As the night stretched on, Emily allowed herself to imagine a future where fairness and justice weren't just ideals, they were a reality. She knew it would take time. There would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome, but she was ready for whatever came next. This was just the beginning, and as long as she had the truth on her side, she knew she would never stop fighting. With that, the journey toward justice for countless students across the nation had begun. The future was uncertain, but Emily was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the fight for equality in education was far from over. But for the first time, the forces of justice had the upper hand, and the system was finally beginning to crack.